Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Today's date is December 17th, 2011. Okay, I have to start with an announcement or a request. As we go on into the future, we're going to need a few people to help with the, we call this the internet connection and recording. So we need altogether 3 people, and we have 1 so far. Is there anybody else? Now, to help with this, you have to come here at 9 a.m., is that correct? And so we need people who will be willing to volunteer to come every week that we have the class. And I will have the class, we won't have it the next 2 weeks, because there's a retreat here. So we'll have the next class January 7th, and then I'll have 3 classes in January, January 7th, 14th, 21st. Then we'll break for the winter, and then we'll resume probably middle of March, and then continue from middle of March on. And so do we have anybody who would be willing to come whenever we have the class, to be able to come at 9 a.m. to help set up the recording? Okay, that's good. And good if you would give your contact information to Bo Wei, who's sitting in front of the computer. Or to Kaidi? Okay, to Kaidi. That's 1. You'll be able to come every time? Okay, so you'd have to be here at 9 a.m.
They only need to take turns. They don't really need to...
Oh, that's also a possibility, to rotate.
Just to rotate.
Yeah. Okay, so people can do it, you know, a few weeks, then take a break, then other people can take over. We'll start off with these 3 then. Bo Wei. Your name is?
Nick.
Nick. Nick, is that?
Yeah, Nick.
And Joan. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so now we can come back to our sutta. And we have been doing, over the last few weeks, the Maharahulovada Sutta, the greater discourse of advice to Rahula. And this is the Buddha's instruction on various approaches to meditation to his own physical son, the young monk Rahula. And if you remember at the beginning, when the sutta opens, or close to the opening, Rahula gets some brief instructions from the Buddha. Then, after getting these instructions on contemplating the body, or the 5 aggregates as being non-self, he goes off and sits in meditation under a tree. And then Venerable Sariputta, who's the teacher of Rahula, sees him sitting there and instructs him to practice mindfulness of breathing. Venerable Sariputta says, Rahula, develop mindfulness of breathing. When mindfulness of breathing is developed and cultivated, it is of great fruit and great benefit. Okay, so later that same day, Rahula goes to the Buddha and asks him, how does one practice mindfulness of breathing? But the Buddha doesn't answer Rahula's question straight away, but rather he goes first into a detailed explanation of contemplating the body in terms of the 5 elements: earth, water, fire, air, and the space element. And then he gives him brief advice or admonitions to practice some of the other meditation subjects, the 4 sublime states or divine dwellings: loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. Then the meditation on the unattractive nature of the body or foulness, and then the meditation on impermanence. And we could say perhaps that the Buddha is preparing Rahula for instructions on mindfulness of breathing. And it's somewhat interesting that, when anybody comes to learn Buddhist meditation to a meditation teacher or meditation center, almost the first instruction that is given is mindfulness of breathing. So we always think, mindfulness of breathing, this is sort of like the ABC of meditation. And then when after you learn mindfulness of breathing, then you get into the real stuff, what lies beyond mindfulness of breathing, whether it's Vipassana or in the Zen tradition, Shikantaza or Koan meditation, or in Tibetan meditation, they call it Dzogchen or Mahamudra. So those are taken to be like, the real stuff, and mindfulness of breathing is like learning the ABCs. That's the common assumption. But actually, according to the text, the Buddha himself used mindfulness of breathing as his own vehicle to the attainment of enlightenment. So when the Buddha sat down under the Bodhi tree on the night of his enlightenment, the practice that he cultivated was mindfulness of breathing. And we find that many of the great disciples themselves practice mindfulness of breathing. And again throughout his teaching career, the Buddha emphasized the practice of mindfulness of breathing, and not only for beginners. And it seems here in this sutta that the Buddha is preparing the way to mindfulness of breathing by instructing Rahula in these other meditation subjects in order to clear away the hindrances or mental obstacles, so that then Rahula, when he enters mindfulness of breathing, he will have a smoother course of development. And so the main hindrances, normally the main hindrances of the mind, we have the 5 hindrances, and of the 5 hindrances, the 2 coarse or gross hindrances are the first 2. Sensual desire, or sensual craving, and ill will, anger, or hatred. And so the preliminary meditation subjects, loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, can be seen as the antidotes to anger and ill will. And then the meditation on the unattractive nature of the body is the direct antidote to sensual desire. And also the perception of impermanence also will help to reduce desire or craving. And then the hindrance or mental block that was especially strong in Rahula's mind was his pride based on his own physical beauty. Because he was a young man in the prime of life. Apparently he was quite handsome, physically well built. He's 18, according to the commentary, 18 years old. So he's full of what the suttas call the pride of youth, the pride of good health, and the pride of life or vitality. And so the Buddha teaches him the 4 elements meditation in order that he can gain some insight into the nature of the body, and in this way reduce his pride or his attachment based on the body. And so, after all of these preliminary instructions have been laid down, then the Buddha probably feels that Rahula is now been sort of properly prepared so that he can absorb and practice the instructions on mindfulness of breathing. And so now in paragraph 25, he starts the actual instructions, or actually in paragraph 24, he repeats the injunction on mindfulness of breathing. So after completing all the other meditation subjects, then he introduces Anapanasati. He says, develop meditation on mindfulness of breathing. When mindfulness of breathing is developed and cultivated, it is of great fruit and great benefit. And how is mindfulness of breathing developed and cultivated so that it's of great fruit and great benefit? Okay, first what we call mindfulness of breathing in Pali, I'll write the Pali name. Okay, so mindfulness of breathing is anapanasati. The word ana means the in-breath, and pana means the out-breath, and sati means mindfulness. It's actually ana and up, I think it's, oh, I'm sorry, it's anapana. Sati. And, okay, sati is mindfulness. And sometimes we find, this is in the Sutta Nikaya, in the section on mindfulness of breathing, we find the instructions are given for anapanasati samadhi, which means concentration. Samadhi is concentration, collectedness of mind, mental composure, through mindfulness of breathing. So this full expression brings out the sort of the direction of anapanasati. The reason that one is developing mindfulness of breathing is to obtain the samadhi, the concentration that is reached through being mindful of the in and out breaths. Okay, so now the Buddha begins the instruction in paragraph 25, and he begins with the sort of elementary steps in practicing mindfulness of breathing. So he says, here Rahula, a bhikkhu or a monk, gone to the forest, or to the root of a tree, or to an empty hut. Okay, so this begins by explaining the ideal, by mentioning the ideal places for practicing mindfulness of breathing. So because the objective is to be able to keep the mind consistently on the breath, so it's important to have a somewhat secluded and quiet place. So the ideal place in the Buddha's time for monastics was to go to the forest. But actually what's interesting, if you've ever lived in a forest, you know, it's not so quiet there. There's lots of, especially at night, insects come out, chirping, and birds singing, and different kinds of night animals prowling around, and growling and howling. But for some reason, my own experience, those kinds of sounds are not disturbing. It actually adds to the peacefulness. Okay, and then within the forest or in a place like the grove where the Buddhist monasteries were situated, the ideal place, at least according to the text, is to sit at the root of a tree. But if you've ever tried sitting outside at the root of either the root of a tree or anywhere outside, well, it also meets annoying problems, like especially mosquitoes. So what's developed in at least the Thai meditative tradition is they use a device, I think it's pronounced krot. It's constructed like an umbrella, but it has a big overhead parasol, and then suspended from the parasol is a mosquito net. So when you sit down, you hang the krot from the branch of a tree, and then you spread out the net so it surrounds the body to protect you from the mosquitoes. Okay, so the root of a tree or an empty hut. This would be just, we call it kuti, a little hut or cottage in a quiet place. And if you don't have the luxury of the forest, the root of a tree, or an empty hut, just choosing in your house or apartment a quiet room where you won't be disturbed, where, especially a place that's dedicated to the practice of meditation. So when you practice there, daily, over time, you're building up peaceful, harmonious vibrations in the place, so that whenever you come to the place and you sit down there, then you can feel peaceful, and your mind picks up on the vibrations, the peaceful vibrations, and so the mind easily settles down, and you experience this as something like a refuge, a place of security amidst all of the turmoil and disorder of everyday life. Okay, so one chooses a quiet, secluded place, and then one sits down. So mindfulness of breathing, it's a meditation subject to be practiced in the sitting posture. I know some people do try to be aware of the breath while they're doing the walking meditation. I myself have found it very difficult to maintain a strong awareness of the breath while also trying to be aware of walking. So at least my own way of practice, if one wants to do mindfulness of breathing, do it in the sitting posture. And if one is going to be walking back and forth, then do another meditation, usually the mindfulness of walking. Okay, then when one sits down, then one folds the legs crosswise. It doesn't have to be the full lotus, it can be half lotus, quarter lotus, or what they call sometimes the Burmese posture. This is where one leg is on the ground, the other leg is like this. The legs aren't actually crossed. They're not crossed so that one is on top of another, but the two legs are sort of parallel against one another on the ground or on the mat. And then one keeps the body erect. This is extremely important. So one positions first the head so that the nose is directly above the belly button. First, hold the head as if one is looking straight out. And then one can let the head tilt downwards a slight angle, maybe about a 30-degree angle, 20, 30-degree angle, so it's slightly tilted downwards. Then the mouth should be closed with the tongue resting lightly against the roof of the mouth. And the eyes should be closed, lightly closed. though in some traditions they teach to let the eyes remain very slightly open. But I personally find it easier to keep the eyes completely closed, but lightly, not forcing them closed. Okay, and then one establishes mindfulness in front of one. Okay, now this is my understanding, is that this expression, establishing mindfulness in front of you, I found the way the term used in the suttas, or the expression is used in a very general sense. So it's not specifically tied to mindfulness of breathing, but it seems to be used just in a way, as a way of indicating that when one is sitting down to do meditation, one sets up mindfulness. But some of the early commentarial texts take this expression in a rather technical and precise way, and they explain it to mean that when one practices mindfulness of breathing, one establishes the mindfulness in an area. It can be under the nostrils, slightly inside the nostrils, or around the nostrils, wherever one feels the breath most clearly coming in and going out. Okay, what I have actually found, both with myself and with instructing others, that it's very difficult to keep the mindfulness sustained on this area right around the nostrils or slightly inside the nostrils. Because it seems to be a very, very subtle place, and so the impact of the breath there is very subtle. So initially one might be able to keep the breath there, for the attention there, the mindfulness, for quite some time, like 2 or 3 breaths. But then the mind starts wandering. So what I suggest doing, at least this is a technique that I found helpful. Initially, when one sits down, one establishes the mindfulness in the body itself, so that one tries to keep the mindfulness spread out broadly throughout the body. So one is aware of the body itself as taking in the whole mass of the body in one act of mindfulness, in one extended spread, let's say one spread of mindfulness. So one becomes mindful of the whole body is a totality. And then one keeps the mindfulness spread out through the body for maybe half a minute or so. And then one becomes aware of breathing without focusing on a particular place, but just becoming aware of the breath, the act of breathing, in any way in which it stands out most clearly. So one might experience the expansion and contraction of the chest as sort of the most conspicuous manifestation of the breath, or the rising and falling of the abdomen. And so one follows the in and out breathing wherever one experiences it most clearly and distinctly, without trying to home in too sharply on any one place. But then as the mind settles in on the breath, so that one can follow the in and out breathing fairly consistently, then one can gradually let the mind move to the area around the nostrils, slightly inside the nostrils, just beneath the nostrils, wherever one picks up the sensation of the breath most clearly. And then one lets the mind, I use the expression, let it sit comfortably on that area, not trying to push the mind onto that area, not forcing it, because that makes the mind tight and strains the mind, and it could strain the muscles and nerves also. But just letting the mind rest or sit on that area very softly, very gently, and sort of the key to success, the way I would formulate it, is to strike a healthy balance between consistency of awareness and softness or gentleness of awareness. So that the mind is not pushing itself into that area. So that you're not pushing the mind onto that area, but just letting it rest there. Almost as if one were taking a feather or a piece of cotton and putting it around the nostrils, almost as though it were like tickling the nostrils, or the area just beneath the nostrils. Okay, and then one becomes mindful of the breath in that area. And if the mind, of course, initially, if it just wanders a few times, then one just notes it and brings the mind back to that area. But if the mind is wandering a lot, continuously wandering, then what I suggest is again bringing the mind back to this panoramic awareness of the body, keeping it simply being aware that there is the body, or simply aware of body, presence of the body, maybe for about half a minute or a minute. Then again, becoming aware of the breath in whichever way, as one experiences it most clearly and distinctly in the body. Again, it could be the expansion and contraction of the chest. And then, as one is able to follow the conspicuous manifestation of the breath, then at a certain point one can again bring the mind back to the area around the nostrils and again focus upon it there. Okay, so this is how I would say that one keeps ever mindful, he breathes in, mindful, he breathes out. In fact, that is like really, it's like that is the main instruction in mindfulness of breathing. It's really all sort of succinctly expressed in that one phrase, that one expression. Ever satova asasati, sato basasati. Sato eva, that means mindful, and that eva is somewhat emphatic. It doesn't literally mean ever, but it will mean like really mindful or definitely mindful. Emphatically mindful, he breathes in. Mindful, he breathes out. So that is the core instruction in mindfulness of breathing. And now what's going to take place in the following sections is an expansion of the mindfulness of breathing into 16, sometimes called 16 steps or 16 aspects. And as we'll see, these 16 aspects actually fall into 4 groups of 4 tetrads. And the 4 tetrads are determined or governed by the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 bases of mindfulness. And so the first tetrad is mindfulness of breathing viewed in terms of contemplation of the body. This is the way we find mindfulness of breathing explained or expounded in the Satipatthana Sutta, the discourse on the establishment of mindfulness. Okay, so here the text says, breathing in, excuse me, breathe, excuse me again. Breathing in long, he understands, I breathe in long. Or breathing out long, he understands, I breathe out long. And we'll take the next pair because they go together. Breathing in short, he understands, I breathe in short. Or breathing out short, he understands, I breathe out short. Now what's interesting here to note is the verb in these two sentences. The verb is what's translated as understands, and in Pali this verb is pajanati. And the verb pajanati is the verb from which we derive the noun panya, which is usually translated wisdom. But here, it seems to me pajanati is not really suggesting any kind of deep wisdom or insight, but it's, maybe you could say that it's a discernment or a discerning of the quality of the breath, whether the breath is long or the breath is short. I don't know where one precisely delineates the distinction, but where one precisely draws the distinction between a long breath and a short breath. But in one's own experience, one can see whether a breath is relatively long or relatively short. It's been a bit of a puzzle to me, and I don't know the solution to the puzzle, why the text begins with the long breath and follows it with the short breath. Because in my experience, and I think in almost everybody's experience, when one sits down and begins breathing, the breathing initially is shorter, because the breaths are coming more quickly. But then as the mind and body settle down and the mind becomes more focused, then the breathing seems, or it slows down, and so the breath becomes longer. Anybody have any idea about this? Andrea?
Actually, I usually find the opposite, Bhante. Once I really, really get calmed down, I almost seem to hardly breathe at all.
Actually, that is the case, yeah. Yeah, that is also the case, yeah.
Sort of weird.
Is it more common to focus on the long breath first?
The way it's laid out in the sutta is, it's as if one focuses first on the long breath and then on the short breath. But I think Andrea made a good point that also, as the breath becomes calmer, the breathing slows down, so the breathing is...
It's almost like you're not breathing.
Yeah, the breathing starts to become longer, but then as the breath becomes subtler, then it seems that you call it a shorter breath. So maybe the original distinction is not, as we understand, long breath and short breath, but maybe a gross breath and a subtle breath. Anybody else? Somebody else said?
Well, maybe he was breathing in long intentionally in the beginning in order to calm himself, by taking a deep breath, letting out a deep breath a couple of times, and then
Well, you know, usually we say in the instructions on mindfulness of breathing that one shouldn't intentionally regulate the breath, you know, trying to make it either long or short, but just breathe naturally through the nostrils and then follow the breath just as it's occurring.
Yeah, but it seems like as we are aware of the breath, you know, we follow it more, so it appears that longer, like you said, intentionally, but almost we didn't want it to, but we just, as we follow, we kind of force a new way, make it longer.
Yeah, but this is why at a certain point it becomes longer as we go on attending to it rather than shorter. But I would go with the way the explanation Andrea gave. Okay, so these are, however we understand it, the first two sort of steps to be aware of the breath as long or short. Then we come into the third aspect. And here the verb trains again. He trains thus, I shall breathe in, experiencing the whole body. He trains thus, I shall breathe out, experiencing the whole body. Actually, there are two changes in the verb that take place here. One is the main verb, and that is now the change is from understanding to training, which is sikati. And then the other change in the verb is in the verb within the quote marks, and that is it's changing from present tense to future tense, because one is making a determination, one is training oneself to do something. And so the future expresses the mode in which one will undertake that training. And the particular mode which is indicated by the statement, I shall breathe in, experiencing the whole body. Let me write this whole thing in Pali, even though it's a big, big compound. Okay, so sabba means all or entire, kaya means body, and pati samvedi comes from the verb pati samvedeti, which means to experience. So, pati samvedi, experiencing. Now the commentaries have a way of explaining this, which has been sort of taken over in the Theravada tradition. And I'm not so sure that the commentarial explanation captures the original meaning. And I should say, as a precaution, we have here the 16 aspects or steps of mindfulness of breathing, and different meditation teachers, meditation masters, give different explanations of these 16 aspects. So, if you read Ajahn Buddhadasa, he had a book on mindfulness, I think this is called Mindfulness Through Breathing, Mindfulness with Breathing. He gives an explanation of the 16 steps. Thich Nhat Hanh, I think, has a book. He gives his explanation. Probably Taoq Sayadaw gives an explanation. And other Sayadaws and Acharyas will give their explanations. And I think Goenka has his system of explanation. So there are different ways of explaining. So there's not just one fixed mold, so different teachers have different ways of explaining these. Okay, now the way which prevails in the Theravada tradition is based on the explanation in Visuddhimagga, the path of purification. And that explains to experience the whole body means to be aware of an entire breath from the very beginning of the breath through the, call it the middle portion of the breath, right to the very end of the breath. And then when one is breathing out, then one becomes aware of the very beginning of the out-breath, the whole middle portion of the out-breath, and the very end moment of the out-breath. And so one is making a deliberate, intentional effort to follow each in-breath and each out-breath through its entire course. Okay, it seems to me that this particular instruction, it's very important for developing consistent sustained mindfulness of the breath. But I find it difficult to see that explanation in the actual phrase sabakaya patisamvedi, because kaya is almost always used to refer to the physical body, and sabba seems to emphasize this, the whole body, the entire body. And the verb or the word patisamvedi doesn't seem to me to mean simply to be aware of in the sense of to know or to be following, but to be experiencing. It's actually, patisamvedi is related to the verb vedeti, which means to feel, and the noun vedana, feeling. So it seems to be a much more tactile aspect of experience, much more concrete and tactile aspect of experience than simply noting or being aware of. And so the way I would understand it, and this is very personal, it could be wrong, but sabakaya patisamvedi means that as one is following the breath at the nostrils, around the nostrils, one is also becoming more aware of the whole body. And so there can take place simultaneously an awareness of the breath as it is entering and leaving around the nostrils, and of the entire body as it's sitting there, or in the sitting posture. And also, as one's awareness of the body, one's awareness of the breath strengthens, one also feels more distinctly, more clearly, let us say, the spread of the breath through the whole body. So one doesn't shift the attention away from the area around the nostrils. One keeps the attention focused in that area, but still the experience is now taking in the body in its concrete actuality, or in its actual tactile concreteness. Okay, then we come to the fourth aspect, which is tranquilizing the what's called the bodily formation. So I shall breathe in, tranquilizing the bodily formation. I shall breathe out, tranquilizing the bodily formation. Now the bodily formation, the Pali word is kaya sankhara. And this is identified, well first I'll write it. Yeah, this is identified in Sutta number 44. On page 399, the bodily formation or bodily activity is identified with in-breathing and out-breathing. So this is in paragraph 15 on page 399. In-breathing and out-breathing are bodily states bound up with the body. That is why in-breathing and out-breathing are the bodily formation. So rather than use the full expression in and out breathing, here the text uses the expression bodily formation. And the way I understand it, one is not sort of making a deliberate, intentional effort to tranquilize the bodily formation, but one is simply being mindful of the breath coming in and going out. But as one becomes more and more mindful of the breathing, then naturally the breathing itself becomes calmer, more tranquil, more subtle, so that eventually it seems that the breathing becomes so subtle that one is hardly aware of pulling air in through the nostrils and sending it out through the nostrils. And then it's said that as the breathing becomes more and more subtle, at a certain point one enters into the jhanas, or states of deep concentration, and then in the fourth absorption, the fourth jhana, the in and out breathing stop altogether. So it's in the fourth jhana that the in-breath and out-breath become completely tranquilized, completely still or quiet. Okay, so this is the section on contemplation of the body. Does anybody have any questions on this? If there's a microphone, do we have
But the body versus bodily formation, does formation, does that mean the same thing there that formation means in mental formation? And why say bodily formation rather than just body? What is formation really there for?
Yeah, I don't actually like the word formation as a translation of sankhara. This is sort of an old translation that I inherited. And the word sankhara has different connotations. Maybe we could say here activity maybe is a more satisfactory rendering. So and what's being referred to is not the body itself, but in and out breathing as an activity of the body. Yeah, the passage I pointed out from Sutta number 44, that in-breathing and out-breathing are bodily, they're states bound up with the body, therefore they're called the bodily sankhara.
Okay, so then that understanding of formation would also apply to mental formation mental activity, meaning the will and any kind of active ideation, as opposed to, say, store consciousness and see, right?
This is a big question that opens up a big topic. Because the word mental formation or mental activity, or let's say the word sankhara is used in different contexts with different connotations. So in some contexts, body kaya sankhara means activities, volitional activities performed through the body, like killing, stealing, sexual misconduct. Those are types of unwholesome bodily sankharas. But in the context of meditation practice, the expression bodily activity, kaya sankhara, is used with reference to in and out breathing. And we'll come across mental sankharas just below. In relation to meditation, the mental sankhara means feeling and perception. But in other contexts, the mental formations or mental activities mean volitional activities that occur through the mind without coming to expression through body and speech. If you want to explore this further, we could do so after lunch in the discussion period. Okay, one question. There are so many questions, but I won't have to finish the sutta today before the... But somebody says, if attention is shifted to the whole physical body away from the breath itself, doesn't it disturb the one-pointedness tending to samadhi? I didn't say that the attention is shifted to the physical body. I didn't say that the attention is shifted away from the breath itself. What I said is that the attention remains on the breath